Great. So good afternoon, everybody. So glad you're here. My name is Todd Presner. I'm a faculty member here at UCLA and chair of the Department of European Languages and Transcultural Studies, and formerly was the director of the Leve Center for Jewish Studies. It's great to welcome you here today to today's program with Professor Rachel Einwohner. And we're really happy that she's able to join us from Purdue University to discuss her new book, which is this book, really fantastic and available, I think, for purchase, right? After the talk. The book is called Hope and Honor, Jewish Resistance During the Holocaust, and I'll give a very brief introduction to the book and to Professor Einwohner in just a second. I do want to say that the event is part of the Michael and Irene Ross program in Yiddish Studies, and books are available for purchase right afterwards. We do hope that you'll join us for more Leve Center events. There's a number of flyers in the back there, you can pick them up. And one request that we have, which is if you have a cell phone with you that may be on ring mode, just to go ahead and silence it right now. And if you have to take a call, feel free to step out into the hallway. So many accounts that we often hear about the Holocaust and Jewish people in the Holocaust are as passive victims, often going, as we often hear, like sheep to their death. And we often ask the question, or often hear the question, why did the Jews not resist? And what's, I think, so interesting about this book is precisely that asking a somewhat flipped question, or really quite flipped, why did Jewish people resist? And in fact, to look at instances of resistance, particularly in the Warsaw Ghetto and the Vilna Ghetto, and what catalyzed that resistance, how it happened, when it happened, under what circumstances, and how Jews made assessments of the various kind of threats that were facing them. As a sociologist, a social scientist, Professor Einwohner brings a number of disciplinary and methodological approaches that complement, I think, and really enhance our historical knowledge about what had happened in these ghettos, and relies particularly on testimony. And that's one of the things I think is so interesting about this book, is that there's so many voices of survivors who are bearing witness to these acts of resistance that had happened in the ghettos, and in some cases didn't happen, in one particular case where she looks at the Lodz ghetto in particular. Let me just say a few words about Professor Einwohner before I turn the floor over. I mentioned she's a professor of political science, a political sociologist actually, who teaches about social movements at Purdue. Her research focuses on the dynamics of protest and resistance, and includes questions related to protest emergence and effectiveness, how protests emerge, how they're effective, and particularly the role of gender and other identities in the dynamics of protests, and the success and solidarity of diverse movements. She's explored these topics in numerous case studies, not only the Holocaust, but also the animal rights movement, college-based anti-sweatshop movement, and of course, Jewish resistance during the Holocaust, which will be the topic of today's conversation. More recently, she's looking at using social media, particularly Twitter data, to examine diversity and inclusion in contemporary social movements. Her work has been published in numerous places, just to mention a couple: the American Sociological Review, the American Journal of Sociology, Social Problems and Mobilization, has received numerous grants, including from the National Science Foundation and the NEH, and her latest book came out in 2022 with Oxford University Press. And I understand the book is it's a fantastic book. I encourage you all to look at it and read it. You will get a preview today and have a chance to engage with the ideas and the arguments in greater detail. I do just want to add that she's within the American Sociological Association, also plays a role in terms of disciplinary leadership, and recently served as the chair on a section dedicated to collective behavior and social movements. And so her insights will be especially valuable today for, I think, assessing the historical archive and really understanding what made Jewish resistance possible and successful, and in some cases not successful in these ghetto contexts. So please join me in welcoming Professor Einwohner. Thank you so much. I will give the floor to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you all so much for coming. Todd, thank you so much for that lovely introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you to the Leve Center and to Chelsea White, who made my trip so seamless and easy, and to the folks I had a delightful lunch with, Eliza, and Michael and Jared, who's not able to be here right now, and just thank you all for being here. This is my first trip to the UCLA campus. I actually grew up in Berkeley, but never made it down to UCLA. So it's a beautiful campus, and I'm very pleased and very honored to be here. So, as Todd said, as Professor Presner said, I'm going to be talking about my recent research that was published in this book that I titled Hope and Honor. And it focuses on Jewish resistance in three particular places, three Jewish ghettos during the Holocaust. The ghettos in Warsaw, Vilna or Vilnius in Lithuania, or I'm going to say it as an American, Lodz or Lodz or Łódź. Three different places. And I want to start off my talk by telling you how I came to study the topic of Jewish resistance. I'm not an historian. I don't even really consider myself a Holocaust scholar. I am a sociologist. I thank Todd again for that lovely description and introduction to my work. I'm a sociologist who studies protest and resistance. Protest and resistance in different places and different times. And so I come to the study of Jewish resistance as a case, as an example of mass resistance, mass protest. But I want to tell you a little bit more about how I came to this. It's a personal story, but I hope you find it interesting, and I hope that it helps give you a sense of where I'm coming from as a person and as a sociologist, and then I'll launch into the talk. Oops, okay, I already blew my cover here. All right. I remember exactly the day that I decided that I wanted to study Jewish resistance during the Holocaust. It was April 19th, 1993, which was 30 years ago, which makes me feel very, very old. But April 19th, 1993, and probably a lot of you know your history and know that April 19th is a very important anniversary. It's the anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, which happened in Warsaw on April 19th, 1943. So April 19th, 1993 was the 50th anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. And on that day, I was in graduate school. I was living in Seattle. I'm a proud alumnus of the University of Washington in Seattle. And I was living in Seattle at the time, but I went home to see my parents in Berkeley. I guess it was Passover. That part I don't remember, but I was home visiting them. And back in 1993, remember when we used to read newspapers on paper? You young people don't remember that, but people my age do. So in the 90s, my parents got the New York Times delivered to their home. Remember it came in the blue bag, right? So I was home in Berkeley visiting my parents, and the New York Times paper was on their bed in their bedroom, and I walked by and picked up the paper, and this is what I saw. Front page, I think below the crease, but still front page. It is an article titled Memories Live of the Warsaw Ghetto Battle. And it talked about a young woman, the woman depicted there, who was 16 years old in 1943. She was confined to the Warsaw Ghetto as a Jewish woman, and she was working in a factory in the Warsaw Ghetto, a factory that sewed uniforms for German soldiers. And fighting broke out. Jewish people were fighting back against Nazi soldiers who were coming into the Warsaw Ghetto attempting to deport them. And this woman, who was only 16 years old, she says in this article that she grabbed a pair of scissors from this factory, this uniform factory where she was working, grabbed a pair of scissors and got ready to fight. And she grabbed the scissors because that was all she had to fight with. I read this, I still remember it. I remember this scene so well in my brain. I was blown away by this. And I'm kind of embarrassed to admit this, but it's, whatever. We learn at our own pace. I had never heard of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising before that day. I was 27 years old. I grew up in a Jewish family. I went to Hebrew school. I learned Jewish history. My maternal grandparents are from Warsaw. They survived, which is how my mom survived, which is how I am here. But no one had ever told me about this. And I'm not blaming them at all. Maybe my grandparents didn't want to talk about it. That's fine. Maybe my mom didn't want to talk about it. But for whatever reason, I had never heard about this. And I was blown away. I'd never heard of Jewish people fighting back. I bought into that myth of Jewish passivity, that Jewish people, as Todd said, went to the slaughter, like sheep. We've heard that phrase so many times. So I was fascinated by this just as a person, as a human, as a Jewish person. But I was also fascinated by this as a sociologist. So now I'm launching into the more kind of, academic part of this talk. In the early 90s, I was working on my dissertation. I was learning all about social movements and revolutions and reading all this sociology and political science and learning all these theories about why mass movements happen, why revolutions happen. And it seemed to me that our theories could not account for this case. So this is my introduction into why I want to study this as a sociologist. The Warsaw Ghetto uprising is what we would call a deviant case, a case that doesn't seem to fit what our theories teach us about why something happens. And very, very quickly, and at least back in the early 90s, the main theories, we've branched out a lot since then, but the main theories back then would say, if a mass protest movement or if a mass revolution is going to happen, a couple of things need to happen first. The people who are going to revolt need resources. They need the stuff to make their resistance happen, whether that's weapons or whatever else. They need what we call political opportunity, some sort of opening in the broader political system that affords them a little bit of breathing room, a little bit of window that tamps down the repression a little bit and gives them a chance to mobilize. And they also need hope. They need some sense that they will achieve whatever goal they have. Well, it seemed to me that the Jewish people living in the Ghetto of Warsaw had none of those things. Very few weapons, no window of opportunity, and as the record shows, they didn't believe that they would succeed. They fully expected to die in the course of their resistance. So why did they resist? We can understand maybe the motivation to resist, but how is it possible that this resistance happened? That's the question that I'm trying to answer with my work. And here's an image that I show to my undergrads a lot, and also I talk, occasionally, I'd like to do it more, but occasionally I talk to middle school students about Jewish resistance during the Holocaust. And this is a very famous picture that you might recognize. It's an image of Jewish resistance fighters captured during the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. And to me, this image really illustrates this concept of it just really shows why this is so fascinating to me. We have the people in the front who are the Jewish fighters. Do I have my little thingy here? Yeah. In the front who have been captured, and they are surrounded by soldiers. And just look at the contrast between these folks and this person back here and the people that they were fighting against, right? So the soldiers have weapons and helmets and uniforms and are trained militarily. The people fighting against them, I don't think this woman even has shoes, right? So a difference of resources. We know that they didn't think that they would succeed. They didn't think they would fight their way out of the Warsaw Ghetto. And I'm always struck by, it's probably hard for you to see, but this woman with a rifle pointing at her, okay, there's a soldier right here. She, to me, seems to have this defiant kind of look, even though someone's pointing a rifle at her. And probably she was put to death right after this picture was taken. This image was taken by a German soldier, by the way. So I'm just fascinated by this, and I want to know, why did this resistance happen? So as a sociologist, as a social scientist, we are trained, and I have some sociology colleagues in the room, we are trained to think in terms of variation across cases. So if I want to know why the Warsaw Ghetto uprising happened, it's really helpful to compare the Warsaw Ghetto to another similar ghetto where the same kind of resistance did not happen. So in my work, I actually draw on 3 different cases, 3 different ghettos that were similar in many ways, but of course different in other ways. All 3 very large ghettos from major cities in pre-war or pre-World War II, Eastern Europe. Each of them had a Jewish population of about 30%. But there was a difference across these ghettos in terms of sustained armed resistance. So a sustained armed uprising happened in the Warsaw Ghetto. In the ghetto in Vilna, there were plans for an uprising like that, but they couldn't pull it off. And they ended up deciding, the resistance fighters ended up deciding to leave the ghetto and fled to the forest and carried out resistance activities in other ways. And then the third case is the Lodz Ghetto, where there was no sustained armed uprising. And as a sociologist, I'm really interested in accounting for the variation across these three cases. I want to say very clearly at the outset, I'm interested in a particular kind of resistance, the sustained armed uprising. I would never say that there was no resistance in Lodz, because resistance can take lots of different forms. There's individual resistance, there's cultural resistance, there's spiritual resistance. All of these are valid. I just want to focus on this particular outcome, the sustained armed uprising, because that's the kind of stuff that I study. And I'm sure you all know where these three cities, where these three ghettos were. The ghettos are long gone, the cities are still there. Vilna is in present-day Lithuania. These cities are marked by the stars. Vilna is present-day Lithuania. The capital city is now called Vilnius. Warsaw's in the middle, and then Lodz is to the southwest. Okay. So I said at the outset that I'm not an historian. But that doesn't mean that I don't take history seriously. And in this project, I followed methodological principles of what we call comparative historical sociology. And there's some fine comparative historical sociologists in the room with me as we speak. The goal is to try to understand how things vary across time and place. We take time very seriously. We take place very seriously, as historians would. We don't use the same kind of materials. I rely a lot on secondary sources, but I also rely on archived Holocaust testimonies, as Todd said, and I'll quote a little bit from some testimonies that I got from the Shoah Foundation here in Los Angeles, survivors from Warsaw, Vilna, and Lodz. But my goal in drawing on all these materials, the testimonies and the secondary sources, is to create narratives of these three ghettos, to try to understand what happened in each ghetto, how did events unfold over time, and how did the stories of these three ghettos differ across these three ghettos, what was similar, what was different. And in particular, in the stories of these ghettos and creating the history of these ghettos or learning the history of these ghettos, try to find these important turning points that signal some shift in how people were understanding their circumstances that can then help us understand why they did or did not make the decision to rise up in armed resistance, despite the fact that they had no resources, very little resources, no opportunity, and no hope that they would succeed. So I'm not even quite sure how I'm doing on time here. I did not look at that. Okay. I'm going to turn to the stories of these three ghettos. And I'm going to do it pretty quickly in our limited time today, but to try to tell you the story of kind of what happened in Warsaw, how things unfolded, how it unfolded differently in Vilna, and how it unfolded differently in Lodz, and then try to wrap it all up by coming up with some theoretical conclusions. We sociologists also like our theory, to try to offer some explanation for why things happened, why resistance in one place and not in the other two, and then I'll make some broader suggestions for what we can learn from these three cases more broadly. So the story of the Warsaw Ghetto, many of you probably know this history very, very well. All these ghettos, there's over 1,000 ghettos. The United States Holocaust Museum has identified in their research over 1,000 ghettos throughout Nazi-occupied Europe. The Warsaw Ghetto was established in October 1940, so about a year after the start of World War II. All of these ghettos, Warsaw, Vilna, Lodz, and all the other 1,000, they were all meant to be areas of concentration for the Jewish population in a certain city. So all the Jews were forced to go into a very small part of the city, and literally a wall or a fence or some kind of barrier was built around them. So there was some construction that needed to take place. and some relocation of the population. Jewish people had to go into this area that would be the ghetto, and if there were any non-Jewish people living in that area, they had to be moved out. So that took some time. So in Warsaw, it was established in October 1940. But the ghetto itself was not a place of mass destruction, meaning ghettos were not death camps. Okay? Jewish people were deported from the ghettos to the death camps. Plenty of people died in the ghettos because it was very crowded and there was insufficient food and insufficient housing and lots of disease and that sort of thing. But the ghettos themselves were not concentration camps, they were not death camps, they were holding places, essentially, until such a time as the Germans decided to deport people. So in the Warsaw Ghetto, there was a period of about 2 years between the establishment of the ghetto and the beginning of these mass roundups, these mass deportations that we all know so well, these pictures of people being loaded on trains and taken away. Most of the people from Warsaw were sent to Treblinka, the death camp Treblinka. And so that didn't happen until July 1942, but soon after the beginning of those deportations, calls for resistance emerged. Two resistance organizations formed. Actually, the second one, the ZZW, which is the Jewish Military Union, had formed earlier. We don't know as much historically about the second one, the ZZW. We know much more about the first one, the ZOB or the ZOB, and those initials, that acronym in Polish stands for the Jewish Fighting Organization. But what happened was that young people who were activists from pre-war times, communists, socialists, Bundists, all these ists, who were already organized in political circles and in political movements. Once the mass roundups began, the young people, the young activists realized, oh, this is a game changer. Before the mass deportations, everybody in the ghetto thought, oh, this is terrible, we're suffering, this is a really horrible circumstance, but we just need to survive until the war is over. Maybe England will come save us, maybe Russia will come save us, you know. We just need to keep holding on until we're saved by somebody. But once the deportations began, a new, that was a game changer, and people realized this is not just bad war situation. This is not just being under siege. This is genocide, and we are all destined to die. And so the activists who formed these resistance organizations decided, well, if we're all going to die, then we're going to choose the way we're going to die. We're going to die fighting back. We don't think that if we can get together a few guns and create some Molotov cocktails, which is what they did, if we can put this small arsenal together, we don't think we're going to, fight our way out of the ghetto to freedom, but we're going to choose the way we're going to die, and we're going to die fighting as a way to die with honor and dignity. And so April 19th, the German soldiers come in to liquidate the ghetto as a birthday gift for Hitler because his birthday was on April 20th. The Jews fought back, and there was a period of fighting for a couple weeks before the ghetto was ultimately destroyed. So this narrative has a turning point, the Great Deportation, and it has the emergence of resistance, and it has an assessment that we are all going to die, and if we're all going to die anyway, we're going to die fighting as proud and honorable people. I'd just like to quote one of the many testimonies that I have from a survivor of the Warsaw Ghetto in recounting the decision to fight back. He says, there was nothing to lose. I remember that the people who organized the uprising, what was left of the overwhelming, 80% of the Jewish population was already shipped out after the Great Deportation. So after this, we wanted to defend our honor for the name and the memory of our lost family, for the sake of all the Jewish people in the world, and for the honor of all the Jewish people in the world. Okay. So what happened differently in Vilna? In Vilna, the short answer is that there were youth activists in the ghetto. There were youth activists who came to the same conclusion that the youth activists in Warsaw came to, that this is genocide, we are all going to die, and if we're going to die anyway, we're going to die fighting as honorable and as proud people. But they couldn't pull that off the way they wanted to. Their goal was for an armed uprising in the Vilna ghetto, just like in Warsaw, but it didn't turn out that way. The Vilna ghetto was established in September 1941, a year after the ghetto in Warsaw was established. The reason why it took longer was, of course, this audience knows your European history. At the start of World War II, Hitler and Stalin had a secret pact. They divided up Poland and other regions. One part of Poland was occupied by the Germans. The other part of Poland was given to Soviet Russia, given to Stalin. Vilnius, in modern-day Lithuania, was originally given to Stalin. So at the start of World War II, there were no Nazis in Vilna. But in June 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union. Okay, so Vilna now was occupied. And then ghettoization began there, just like it had begun in Western Poland. So the ghetto was established in September 1941, but events unfolded a little bit differently in Vilna. Although the ghetto wasn't formed until September 1941, mass killings of Jews happened pretty much immediately when Germans invaded the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941. And the first mass killings of Jews happened in a wooded area about 8 kilometers away from the city of Vilna called Panar. And there were mass killings of Jews that took place there. And word trickled back to Vilna and then to the Vilna ghetto that Jews were being killed. And the youth activists, the communists and the socialists and the Zionists who were in the ghetto heard about that, correctly assessed the situation. We are all going to die. This is genocide. We're going to die fighting. And they actually came to that conclusion before the people in Warsaw came to that conclusion. Vilna was the beginning of everything, as some scholars have argued. And the youth activists in Vilna actually put the word out, sent out sent out couriers on foot to send the word to other ghettos, Białystok, Warsaw. This is happening in Vilna. Jews are being killed en masse. This is genocide. We're going to fight back. You should too. Okay. So Vilna was very important. So you would think, oh, okay, Vilna was they were the first ones who figured it out. They should have been able to, if it could happen in Warsaw, why didn't it happen in Vilna? So far, everything's happening the same. And a resistance organization emerged in January 1942. A big difference was that there was a ghetto leader, a Nazi-installed ghetto leader, ghetto chief, Jacob Gens, a Jewish guy. He had a very different assessment of what was happening in the ghetto. Whereas the young people were saying, this is genocide, we need to fight back. Jacob Gens said, this is not genocide, we have a way to survive this. All we need to do is work for the Germans in the ghetto factories. Do what the Germans tell you to do. Go work in the factories, sew their uniforms, build stuff for them, whatever. And as we demonstrate our worthiness as workers, that will show our worth, and the Germans will let us live, and the ghetto will survive. So we have these two different kind of competing assessments of the situation. On the one hand, we're all going to die. Let's fight back. On the other hand, we're not going to die if we just do what they tell us to do. And another really important turning point in this ghetto happened in July 1943, a very famous situation. A man named Yitzhak Wittenberg was a member of the resistance, a member of this resistance organization, FPO, the United Partisans Organization. And he was a communist, and he had connections to the communists in the city of Vilna on the other side of the ghetto walls. And another one of his comrades, not a Jewish communist, but somebody on the other side, was captured by the Gestapo and gave up Wittenberg's name. So the Gestapo knew they had a Jewish communist in the ghetto who was working on some kind of resistance. They didn't know what, but they knew Wittenberg's name. And so they said to the ghetto, give us Wittenberg or else. And Wittenberg went into hiding. And the FPO, his comrades, his Jewish comrades, put him in hiding. And the ghetto community went kind of berserk and were clamoring in the streets, marching in the streets, shouting for Wittenberg to turn himself in. They were afraid that if Wittenberg didn't turn himself in, that the ghetto would be destroyed. And Wittenberg turned himself in. There are all these accounts of people, some of the people in my testimony samples, seeing him walking down the street to the Gestapo headquarters and turning himself in, and he died there. It's believed that he brought poison with him and he took his own life. But this incident, called the Wittenberg incident, showed the activists, the young activists who were planning for a armed resistance in the Warsaw Ghetto, it showed them that they didn't have the support of the rest of the community. So they called off the plans for fighting in the Warsaw Ghetto when they fled to the forests and carried out other acts of resistance there. So again, not to say that no resistance happened in Vilna, but it didn't happen exactly, there wasn't a sustained armed rebellion in the Vilna Ghetto. All right, I need to kind of speed up here, but this is a very famous picture, and you probably know all these folks, the partisans of Vilna. These are some of the youth activists, the Jewish youth activists, who called for resistance in the Vilna Ghetto, were not able to make it work because they didn't have the support of the rest of the community, and so they fled to the surrounding forests and formed partisan units and engaged in other kinds of resistance there, like, blowing up Nazi trains when they could and that sort of thing. Very famous resistance fighters, Abba Kovner, very famous, his wife Vitka Kempner, Mishka Korczak, and others. This is a very famous picture. My apologies for not getting the URL site up there as well. And I'm not going to read these quotes, but these are both very famous quotes, especially the first one, that illustrate just the two different ways, these kind of competing visions in the Vilna Ghetto for what's going on, what's happening to us, can we survive, and what should we do about it? The top is this famous manifesto that Abba Kovner wrote and read, calling for resistance, let us not go as sheep to the slaughter. That's quoted all the time, very famous. It is true that we are weak and defenseless, but resistance is the only reply to the enemy. It's better to fall as free fighters than to live by the grace of the murderers. Resist to the last breath. Very different than speeches that Jacob Gens, the Jewish ghetto chief, was telling the community. The basis for the existence of the ghetto was work, discipline, law, and order. Do what the Nazis say and we'll be fine. Two different competing visions, and that affected the kind of resistance that happened or did not happen. And then finally, I'm going to try to wrap this up pretty quick. I want to talk about the Lodz Ghetto because in some ways it's the most interesting of the three. It's the one where armed resistance did not happen. Lodz is fascinating. This was the last case that I learned about. As I was reading about Warsaw, there were so many references to Vilna that I knew I had to learn and read about the Vilna Ghetto and collect data on that ghetto. And there were fewer references to Lodz, but once I dug in, it's a fascinating ghetto. It was one of the earliest ones, established in February 1940, so relatively soon after the start of World War II. But lots of scholars refer to Lodz as being hermetically sealed. Very hard to get in, very hard to get out. And so the story of the Lodz Ghetto is not so much a story with an important turning point, I would say, that changed people's assessment of what was going on or made people choose one strategy versus another. It's not so much about a turning point, it's about a place. It's about the nature of this place. So all of the ghettos were isolated. That was the point, to isolate the Jewish community from everybody else, build a wall around them, and then from there, deport them to the death camps. But the ghettos of Warsaw and Vilna and others, they had fences or walls around them, but if you could breach the wall, and that was possible, not very easy, but it was possible. If you could breach the wall, if you get through a hole in the wall or bribe a guard or something, just on the other side of the wall, you're in the rest of the city of Warsaw. Or just on the other side of the wall, you're in the rest of the city of Vilna, where you could maybe barter for some goods or smuggle in some weapons or escape or get some forged papers or something like that. The Lodz Ghetto had a barrier around it, like a no man's land. So even if you could get over the fence, there was nothing there on the other side of the fence. Well, there were guards who would shoot you, but it was It was harder to get anything, harder to kind of escape into some crowded cityscape. And that had a lot to do with why people refer to this as a hermetically sealed ghetto. It was virtually impossible for anybody to smuggle food into the Lodz ghetto. And so hunger was bad in all the ghettos, but it was especially bad in Lodz. People couldn't smuggle food in. They also couldn't smuggle information in. What that meant was that Lodz was isolated from all the other ghettos. People in Vilna were trying to get word to Lodz to tell them about Jews are being killed, fight back, we're fighting back. But the messengers couldn't get in. The couriers could not get to Lodz. So there was a big lack of information about what was happening. Even when people were deported from Lodz, the community didn't know what happened to those deportees, for the most part. Sometimes little tiny rumors would flitter in, but people dismissed them as being impossible. And so there was a Nazi-appointed leader in the ghetto, this really controversial leader named Einwohner. Like Jacob Gens in Vilna, he told people everything's going to be fine. The way to survive the ghetto is to work, do what the Germans say. And so it's not so much that the people of Lodz believed him, the people of the Lodz ghetto believed him and thought that he had their best interests in mind. It's that they didn't have any other information about what was going on anywhere elsewhere. And so there were youth activists in the ghetto. There certainly were communists. There were, people there, but they didn't reach this conclusion of we're all going to die, so we need to fight back so that we can die a dignified, honorable death. And in the absence of the information, all they had was this: we're starving. We need to work so that the Germans will give us a tiny little bit of food. So there was no, they never got to the point where they advocated for armed resistance, but interestingly, and this ghetto is fascinating, there was lots of resistance in the Lodz ghetto. The people in the factories started going on strike against Rumkowski, not so much to fight against the Nazis, but to fight against the ghetto leadership. Fascinating situation. Anyway, here's this ghetto leader. You've probably all heard a lot about him, very controversial, Rumkowski, giving a speech. Lots of the testimonies talk about all the speeches that Rumkowski gave, telling people to work, go to the factories, work. Even if children are being deported and if old people are being deported, that's okay. As long as you work, the ghetto will survive. All right. And then here's a quote from one of my testimonies, a survivor of Lodz. People were suffering tremendously in this ghetto. Food was very scarce. People were hungry all the time. But it's pretty clear to me from reading the materials I've gathered that people thought they could survive. It wasn't easy, but they didn't have this sense of genocide. They didn't have this sense that there was no way anybody was going to survive and that they would all be put to death. So this survivor, George, talked about something that a lot of people talked about, this saying, don't give up the bread card. In the ghetto, food was rationed. So you'd get a card saying, oh, you can have this many grams of bread for the week, or this much cooking fuel for the week, or whatever. So he, in describing his experiences, he said, we hoped about survival every day of the week. We just hanged on to it. There was a saying in the ghetto, don't give up the bread card. So when they see someone who's getting sick, don't give up. Hold on, we need you. We need you for a witness. Don't give up the bread card. You'll have it okay. If a person died, you had to give up their bread card. So this saying is, don't give up. Hold on one more day. Don't die. We need you. We're suffering. The hunger is tremendous, but we can survive if we can just hold on. All right. So I'm going to wrap this up and share kind of my the way I'm summarizing what I think was going on in these three ghettos. And remember, there's this variation I'm trying to account for. Three ghettos, three different outcomes with respect to a sustained armed ghetto uprising. So what belongs in the black box, or the empty cells? Okay, what's the mechanism, or what's kind of going on there? And here's what I argue. I argue that ultimately it comes down to what people thought was going on. How did they assess their situation? What conclusion did they reach about what was going on? And I argue that the critical conclusion, the conclusion that was necessary but not sufficient for resistance to happen, was a conclusion of genocide. If people concluded that they could not survive, that everybody was going to be put to death, that was what was going to lead to resistance. If you thought you could survive, there's no way you should be resisting. If you thought you could hold on, you're not going to shoot a German soldier, you'll die immediately. But if you think you're not going to survive anyway, maybe you want to amass arms and engage in armed resistance. So conclusions about survivability were critical to decisions about resistance, and the people staged resistance when and where they believed that they would all die. But the critical conclusion of genocide is necessary but not sufficient. Remember, in Vilna, the activists reached that conclusion, but they still couldn't or weren't able to achieve their goal of an armed ghetto uprising. So we also have to look at how do people respond? Based on their conclusions, how do they respond? There were lots of different ways to respond to a bad situation. Resistance was the response chosen by the youth activists, but other people reacted differently based on their assessment of the situation. People thought they could survive, then working to live was the right response. But then in Vilna, we had this really interesting situation of kind of competing responses, competing assessments. Can we survive or not? Should we fight back or not? And that competition, the Wittenberg incident kind of crystallized that competition between these two different ways of understanding the situation and harmed efforts for resistance in the ghetto. So I argue that helps explain the differences across these ghettos. The critical conclusion of hopelessness in the Warsaw Ghetto, plus a response of resistance as honorable, led to a sustained ghetto uprising. Hopelessness plus honor led to a ghetto uprising, whereas there were competing visions, competing conclusions about survivability in the Vilna Ghetto and in Lodz. Despite all the suffering, people thought they could survive somehow, or they hoped that they could. And if you're trying to survive, it's much better to try to work for a little bit of food, hang on one more day, don't give up the bread card, rather than organize for resistance. So I'll end by just saying a few things about what I think I've learned from doing this research as a sociologist who's interested in protest and resistance. So one big takeaway that we all had anyway, and that I learned 30 years ago, is that the myth of Jewish passivity is exactly that. It's a myth. Jewish people did fight back in lots of different ways. We can put that myth to bed right now. But I think that the fact that Jewish resistance did occur needs to be explained. And I've offered some ideas here about critical conclusions and resonant responses, but I think we need much more sociological theorizing about resistance, and especially resistance under these incredibly extreme situations where people's lives are at risk, or they know that they're going to die. What do we do with something like that? Very different than kind of, in the context of a democracy marching around, which is very powerful and very beautiful, but an armed uprising in the Warsaw Ghetto is very different than protest and resistance in other times and places, and so we need to theorize more. But there are still implications that we can learn from this study, I argue, for resistance in other times and places. We cannot assume that seemingly powerless people will not fight back. They can fight back, and they do fight back. So this is a cautionary tale to those, would-be dictators out there, or those actual dictators out there. Repression can backfire. If you want to make sure, if you try to take everything away from people, that might be when they fight back. When they have nothing left to lose, that's when they're going to fight back. And I think that's a very important and very powerful lesson. So, maybe the would-be dictators can learn something from this, but I think that, we can all learn something from, the case of Jewish resistance and, and the fight for honor and dignity. And I'll end on that note. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much
Thank you.
for
Thank you.
the talk, and thank you so much, everyone, for being here. And I'll just I'll begin with a couple of questions, and not a formal response, so to speak, but just a couple of questions that
Yes.
I thought that came out in your talk, but also in the book, and then we'll open up a little bit broader to the audience. But I was wondering, the two figures, Jakob Gens and Chaim Rumkowski, not only played important roles in terms of as a ghetto chief and really kind of, a leader that made assessments that, of course, ended up being ultimately very off base, but they came from a generation that also differed dramatically from the youth activists that you mentioned. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned in Vilna in particular you said the importance of youth activism in the ghetto in Warsaw and Vilna. Mm-hmm. Now, Rumkowski was 67, I think, when he was killed in 1944. Mm-hmm. And Gens a little younger, I think he was 40, or right around there. Mm-hmm. The youth activists were quite a bit, sometimes half, a third of their age. And I wonder about the role of age. I know you looked at the role of gender before, but other metrics that may have played a role, like in the personal outlook that people had at the time, and whether those are something that's either informed some of the testimonies we looked at or some of the assessments that you've made. And I know certainly also with the comparative work that you've done, to the success and failure of certain other kinds of protest movements. Mm-hmm. So the question is really around age.
Yeah, no, thank you for that question. Age is a really powerful factor in these cases, and I think especially notable in something like this because the activists were the age where people were most likely to survive, right? To survive another day. Mm-hmm. In the ghettos, older people were very vulnerable. And younger people were very vulnerable. Mm-hmm. Little children were rounded up and deported because their age is obvious. Mm-hmm. They can't work, and they were at great risk. Same with much older people who were at risk for elderly people. I'd say over 65 or something. Not that that's elderly. Take that back. People of a different age. In all three ghettos, if you had a work card, at certain points, if you had a work card, you could stay. So they're not going to give a work card to a 4-year-old child, and they're not going to give a work card to an 85-year-old person. So part of it is just who was still in the ghetto that could resist, right? Who was strong enough to fight off hunger, disease. So I think there's kind of a structural thing. But there's no question that youth plus involvement in these pre-existing movements, so not just youth, but youth activists. And there's tremendous amount of literature, and I'm sure you all know it, about these youth movements like the left-wing Zionists, the Chalutzim, the Shomer Tzair, kind of had these ideologies that drove them. It wasn't just that they were kind of on the left and that they wanted to emigrate to Palestine or something like that. They had these powerful, solidaristic sense, really kind of like a family, almost like a family feeling of being together and living together communally, and the different movements were kind of different. But I think that that not just their youth, but their political orientation, their communalness also led to resistance. And they were already organized. They were already reading, this just as well as I do. They were already reading, in the ghettos, reading their, communist materials or socialist, whatever they were. And then once they realized that it was a situation of genocide, then they switched. They're like, okay, we're not going to just kind of keep our movement going here by reading all these tracts. We're we're going to fight back.
Right. There's a kind of praxis, right?
Yeah.
I mean, really, it seems to me that you're exactly right, that the having a prior history in these youth movements and having read the major thinkers and work and having an orientation already, I think they essentially were able to shift, and so it seems to me, as something which I haven't studied systematically, but it does seem that would be an element that may tell us something more about how different assessments were made and different kinds of activities then followed. So, one of the other things you mentioned, and thinking also against structural differences, you mentioned a very interesting architectural difference between the ghettos, and of course, one is really the ability to puncture the walls, right?
Yes.
And so this was really important. I mean, the ability to move goods, food, weapons, people, to smuggle things in and out of ghettos, and the ghettos structurally were quite different, especially the Lodz ghetto. And so I wonder if you can talk maybe a little bit more about the isolation of it, or if any of the people that you looked at in terms of the testimony, did they talk about that isolation either in architectural, but also I guess psychological terms? It seemed like networks of information exchange were really critical for catalyzing movements, and in some cases, when those networks didn't exist, those movements also didn't get off the ground.
Yeah. I mean, there's no question about it, and I would say that the primary theme of the data from Lodz is about hunger. Hunger was everything, because if you can't eat, you can't worry about anything else. But the hunger was a function of the architecture, absolutely, in your field and in your words. In the other ghettos, I mean, everybody was hungry, but it was more possible to sneak out, get some food, bring it in. It was very dangerous. You get shot for doing it. Little children were really good at smuggling, and then they got shot coming back in. But that did not happen in Lodz. And so in the testimonies, people would talk about, I'm so hungry, I have, a chunk of bread to last me a whole week. But there was never, but it's interesting what was missing from those testimonies. It's not like they're saying, oh, I wish I could go into the city of Lodz and get some food. That wasn't there. But in the testimonies from the other places, they would talk about smuggled goods. They would talk about the black market, that kind of thing. And certainly in all three ghettos, people would talk about, depending on their job, they might have a chance to get some more food. There were soup kitchens. There were places where food was being prepared. There was a food distribution center. And so if you worked in those places, you might have a chance to get a little bit more food, which could have meant the difference between survival or perishing. But there's no question that people, that the ghetto was isolated, but it's not that, I would say it's not that people said it so explicitly as that. Everything was filtered through hunger, but that was kind of implied, I would say. Yeah.
Let me ask just one last question, and then we'll open up to the conversation. And it's really kind of taking that zoomed out view and reflecting a little bit more, because you studied protest and resistance movements much more broadly. And in the US, in the 60s, contemporary movements in colleges, you're working with social media data now, you studied it historically. And as an expert in what makes protest movements effective, resistance movements effective, what are some of the key elements that you've learned? What can we take out of this comparative view? What's made them effective, and where, if I may ask, where do they fail? So I just kind of just distilling the big questions here. And I know it's a big question, but I think it would be really interesting for the audience to hear it, given your background in studying so many of these social movements comparatively.
Okay, so I'm gonna give you a very dissatisfying answer, but I think it's accurate, and my colleagues can tell me if they agree. So the question of effectiveness is really difficult, because we have to figure out what we mean by effectiveness. In the context of a democracy, a social movement happens, lots of protests. The protesters they shut down a highway, or they have a very effective boycott. Boycotts are very effective, by the way. And they achieve some policy change. Okay, they succeeded, right? But does the policy get implemented? Does the implementation of the policy actually achieve the goals that they wanted? Does it get rolled back in the next administration? I mean, there's all this kind of, so effectiveness is a big messy hunk of stuff. But it's fascinating. And another dissatisfying answer that I have for you is that it all depends. It absolutely depends on the context. Who is doing the protesting? Who is doing the listening? We have some kind of pretty ugly stuff going on in our society right now, where when some people protest, it doesn't matter what they do, they're seen as illegitimate or violent or thugs or something like that, whereas maybe other people of a different profile, race, class, gender, maybe do the same kind of stuff and they have more success, maybe because there's a broader power structure that is amenable to protest from certain kinds of people than others. So not very satisfying, but
very suggestive.
Really depends, yeah.
Let's open up to broader questions, and if you have your hands, we'll just call. Go ahead.
Yeah, it seems to me that the Nazis were well versed in psychological warfare, given the capos and the camps themselves. I'm wondering if the two leaders of Lodz and Vilna were coerced in some way, kind of along the same lines, maybe prototypically, of what they would be actually using in the concentration camps.
So do you mean, thank you for your question, Jeff. So do you mean coerced by Nazis?
Yeah. Coerced by Nazis to be like, I will guarantee your survivability as long as you try to, prevent civil unrest within the, right?
Yeah, I mean, no question. These ghetto leaders and the head of the Judenrat of whatever ghetto we're talking about, they had no power. They were put in place. They were told to, create a ghetto council, a Judenrat, and now do what we say. And if you don't do what we say, we'll kill you. In Warsaw, and note that there was no kind of central ghetto leader in Warsaw. The head of the Judenrat in Warsaw, a man named Adam Chernyakov, he had been trying to do the Nazis' bidding, and on the day of the Great Deportation began, he committed suicide because he knew what was happening. And so he knew, and he, I guess, tried as best as he could, and so he wasn't there. That's another kind of part of the narrative. He wasn't there to counter whatever the activists might have called for. But he knew the truth also, and he took his own life. So, yeah.
And both Gens and Minkowski were deported and killed by the Nazis at the end in 43 and 44.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Mike?
Thanks. That was really interesting. I have many thoughts going on, but just in immediate response to that one, I was surprised actually that you didn't put more emphasis in the talk, in the kind of concluding section, on the leader figures, because it seemed like they play a really key role in, shifting the overall atmosphere in the ghetto, right? When you have someone like Minkowski, right? Really, he may have been coerced, but he also embraced his position and was sort of had dictatorial tendencies himself.
Yes, he did. Yes.
Like the capos.
Indeed, yeah.
Yes.
And that was part of the Nazis doing, but it was also some people listening to it. Anyway, I was surprised that you didn't put a bit more emphasis on the differences in the leadership structure or personalities even.
Yes.
In determining some of those outcomes.
Yeah, and I'm sorry that wasn't clear. I mean, I really do think that those leaders played an important role by putting forth a response to the situation, their assessment, whether they knew the truth or not. Jacob Gens was a military guy. He was a Jewish, an assimilated Jew who was married to a Lithuanian woman, and he had been in the Lithuanian military. So he had to have known what was going on, I think. But he still, there's accounts that he really didn't like the resistors. They were younger than him. He referred to them as the snotty-nosed kids with the sticks. But he also, in a way, respected resistance. In his youth, he had been part of I think he was a part of Beitar. I might be mixing that up a little bit, this kind of right-wing Zionist militaristic kind of youth movement. So in a way, he respected resistance, but he was in this position where he was doing the Nazis' bidding, and I imagine he thought that he would survive. I don't know that for a fact, but I imagine he thought. And so he really didn't want an uprising in the ghetto because that would lead to the destruction of the ghetto immediately, and he was trying to hold on to it. And I guess Rumkowski, the same way, he was a piece of work. He was definitely had these kind of delusions of grandeur, and he was a child molester. I mean, he was a bad news guy, but he was the one they put in power. So.
Yeah. There was a question in the front, I think, or?
I don't have a question. Well, my father fled Lodz in 1907.
Oh.
He was old enough to be my grandfather, specifically from Lunzitza. He was 9, he had a brother 7. The other 13 brothers and sisters never got out.
He left in 1907.
Yes, and
Continue.
he was probably the order and went to a grandfather in Berlin. But there were 13 other brothers and sisters, and I have no relatives. And I know that one sister was a Bolizion, because he used to compare me to her when what you said about when there's nothing left to fight, nothing left to lose, you fight. When I went home and I went back to the business and I told him about what happened in the Leningrad trial, that Jews had brass knuckles and they got an airplane. He said it must be propaganda. And then when he thought about it and we discussed it, he said that exact phrase: when you have nothing left to lose, you fight.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah. Maybe over here, and then we'll go over here.
A couple questions. How big were the actual ghettos? I mean, as far as people go. Also, what was the internal structure of the ghetto as far as like, did they police themselves, or did they have like a, like that? And the third question I had was religion was like rabbis, or who, as far as who is in charge, or who is like handling all those elements? Were they resistors, or were they people that said we have to maintain and so?
Great questions. The war of the three, the Warsaw Ghetto had the highest population at its height, as many as 500,000 people, 450, 500,000 people, in an area of about 1.5 square miles, incredibly densely packed. The other two ghettos also small, not as dense. I want to say like 180,000 at their height. Okay, still a lot of people, but the population ebbed and flowed. People were sent to the ghetto. They would die, even before deportations, they would die from disease and starvation. More people would be deported to the ghetto. It was this kind of holding place. The question about the police, the ghettos had Jewish police who were hated by the ghetto community, because the Jewish police participated in the roundups. They would round people up and send them to the trains. And I was actually at this tremendous conference last week in Germany that was devoted to the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, and there was an Israeli historian who was analyzing some memoirs written by former Jewish police in the Warsaw Ghetto. And, they did it to try to save their own skins, but they were hated. So, the question is, do we have sympathy for them or not? Well, that's kind of his work to uncover. But there was that structure. They didn't have guns or anything. They had like batons, like sticks. Of course, they didn't have guns, but they were Jewish police. They had little hats and that kind of thing. And then third, what was the role of rabbis in
religion? As far as like within the ghetto, was there religious leaders versus, say, more secular, more, what were they, like the men you mentioned?
Yeah, so certainly at the height of every ghetto population, there was plenty of religious activity, because everybody shoved in there. So religious people and secular people. In the Warsaw Ghetto, and forgive me for not remembering this about the other two ghettos, in the Warsaw Ghetto, religious worship was outlawed, but it still took place, and that's a form of resistance. That's spiritual resistance. So there were still rabbis who were conducting services, and they do it in hiding. But as time wore on in each ghetto, if we're talking about elderly rabbis, they were more susceptible to passing away just because of age, lack of sanitation, lack of medicine, lack of food, etc. So older generations, also religious people were, religious men with beards were especially attacked by Nazi soldiers in the streets because to harass them, just terrible images of like people getting their beards yanked out and just horrible, horrible, horrible stuff. But one more thing I'll say is that the youth activists both in Warsaw and in Vilna were not religious people. Some were communists, some were socialists. I mean, they were all Jews, of course, but their orientation was not towards prayer and towards God. It was towards the movement, towards the text, communism, socialism. That was where they found their meaning. It doesn't mean they weren't Jewish, but they weren't praying people. And there's some accounts of like some community meetings in Warsaw, in the Warsaw Ghetto, where different people, members of the community, are trying to figure out what to do. And some of the rabbis are saying, we have to pray. And some of the youth are saying, that's not going to help. So definitely different ways of understanding the threat and how should we respond. And religious people would turn to prayer, I think, rather than resistance.
Just on top of that, with death, with religious right, were there any what happened to a body when they allowed people to bury? Were they allowed to mourn? Were the city shiver, anything like that?
Yeah, so at first there were, so each ghetto had its kind of, timeline. And so in the beginning of the ghettos, definitely, proper burials and shiva and mourning and that kind of thing. But with time, as the communities, more and more suffering, somebody would pass away and, just horrible stuff would happen. People would be dumped. There were so many deaths that there would be mass graves. Just because, less manpower, less person power, and, it's really, really sad. But if you go to Warsaw, and probably many of you have been there, there's a Jewish cemetery there. And you can see the headstones from people who died earlier. You can see Adam Cherniakov's grave there. He died and had a proper burial and that kind of stuff. Yeah.
So take this, maybe we take two questions together if we can. Maybe take your question and this question together. And if you want to add a question, that's fine. Let's go first here, so we can talk.
Such an incredible presentation, and I am one of those who did not know about resistance. And so your message is really important. I mean, the only resistance I ever learned was Masada, right?
Mm-hmm.
And to know this information is I think it's very empowering, and would love it to be part of a Jewish education. And what I'm wondering is what we're learning about this. How does this inform us as Jewish people today, as well as do you see parallels of what's happening in Ukraine?
Mm-hmm.
All right, so we'll take a couple of, go ahead.
Oh, I just want to say that even before the Holocaust, there was always this schism. I have a sociology degree here.
Good for you.
My grandfather was a Hasidic rabbi, but his daughter belonged to Polizion, which was, she was a Zionist.
Mm-hmm.
And I was with Chaim Seidler last week. I don't know if you know him.
I don't.
He's exceptionally knowledgeable, exceptionally.
He's a former director of Hillel Center.
Things going in our families
Uh-huh.
with the Hasidic rabbis and the socialist kids.
Mm-hmm.
All right, go ahead.
There was an article recently in Tablet about, I think, pronounced Malines.
Oh, the hiding places, the Molinas. Yes.
It
Uh-huh.
occurred to me as you were presenting this, and that was actually a memoir by Abraham Sutzkever,
Mm-hmm.
who talked about these Malines.
Mhm.
I didn't know about them.
Mm-hmm.
And it occurred to me that maybe there was another way of dealing with this. It wasn't just stay and work or resist, but it was also maybe a third way or different way was to hide.
Mhm.
And then
Yes.
maybe that was one of the choices that came to my mind from these Malines.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that was more pronounced in Vilna, as opposed to in other places.
Mm-hmm.
And the other part that occurred to me was Warsaw being such a large center.
Mm-hmm.
You didn't have a higher concentration of radicals, at the time, socialists, communists, Zionists, as opposed to the other ghettos.
Mm.
So if there was a higher concentration because there were more people to begin with in Warsaw, then you obviously have it was more fomenting in Warsaw than in the other places. Maybe you just had a few of them comparatively. So I don't know if that was it.
Mm-hmm.
And even in Warsaw, it happened. The uprising was way at the end of the war. I mean, it was in 43. Right?
43, yes.
But by then, I think your stats were that 80% of the people were deported.
Mm-hmm.
At that point, somebody would say, the jig is up.
Mm-hmm.
What's the point of staying, working, to try to survive when we know? So I'm wondering if, the hiding, the concentration of how many radicals, and also, the period when the resistance actually occurred, had anything to do with it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. So, Elaine, can I answer his, because that's fresher in my mind, and then I'll come to you. So, the Molinas, the hiding places, absolutely. I firmly believe that is a form of resistance. Anything that thwarts the intent of the murderer to murder you is resistance. So if you go into hiding, I mean, Anne Frank, in my opinion, was a resistor, and there's some people say she should have fought back. I don't know if you guys read this essay, about saying that Anne Frank, should have fought back. Well, she went into hiding. She was trying to, protect herself. Anyway, so yes, I believe that's a form of resistance, not the form of resistance that I'm interested in explaining, but it definitely happened, and it happened in Warsaw. So people built these bunkers. The resistors did not build bunkers, but kind of regular people who were still there built bunkers to try to hide, to try to avoid deportation, and they put food and fuel and blankets and so when the Warsaw Ghetto was destroyed, those people died because the buildings fell in on them, or they were captured, or something like that. So definitely there were the Molinas in the ghettos. In terms of Warsaw was a really big place, and there were probably lots of youth activists there. Vilna was also a huge center of Jewish life. It's referred to as the Jerusalem of Lithuania. Lots of universities there, lots of really important movements, not just in terms of political movements, but religious movements. The famous Gaon of Vilna, this religious leader, was there, and so that was also maybe not as big a city, but definitely had a strong concentration of just Jewish political, philosophical, religious life. And Lodz was also a big city. It was an industrial city. Lodz was some people call it the Manchester of Poland. It was a textile center. So lots of factories, and so also lots of workers' unions, and so lots of political activity in Lodz as well. So now, I can't speak to smaller ghettos, but that was one of the many reasons why I wanted to choose these three for my analysis, because they were big cities and they had a lot going on in them pre-war. But those are really great questions, and I thank you. Okay, so I agree. I think this is a really important story to tell, but Elaine, you and I are older. I mean, I was at this conference in Germany last weekend, and there were a lot of Israeli historians there, and when I was telling them that, I was 27 before I learned about the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, they were like, we learned it when we were 5 years old, so different places obviously teach Jewish history differently. And I wonder if, I don't know, I don't have children, but I wonder if this is more of the curriculum in Hebrew schools now than when I was growing up, possibly. And also with, the internet and YouTube and all that kind of stuff, probably kids have access to lots more history than I did growing up, and relying on either classes that I took or, parents teaching me stories or grandparents teaching me stories. Ukraine is really fascinating, and I'm certainly no expert on Ukraine, but it's not lost on me that the leader of Ukraine is a Jewish man, and that the government of Russia was with their propaganda and trying to say, trying to justify a war against Ukraine by saying these things, that they're Nazis or whatever, just pure propaganda. Same kind of stuff, Nazi propaganda against Jews, that we have diseases and that whatever, and we're dangerous and we need to be rooted out, and all that kind of stuff. So those parallels I see. I'm not sure if you're asking if there will be resistance in Russia about the Ukraine war, or if there's going to be resistance, civilian resistance in Ukraine. I think all Ukrainians are in on, fighting for their country right now. So I guess I'm not quite sure I know. Maybe we could have more of a conversation about it.
Yeah, we can talk more about
Yeah.
sociologically, what's happening in the resistance in Ukraine, that they are fighting back and not assimilating
Yes.
in Russia. Are there some parallels sociologically?
Oh, sure. Well, fighting because of an existential threat. Ukraine's fighting for their lives, right? And I think, right. I think that's I need to think more about that. And again, I'm no expert on Ukraine, but I think that's fighting because there's nothing else to do. Because if you don't fight, you're going to die. If you do fight, maybe you'll die, but at least you're fighting, and you have that pride, and to show the world that we're not going to back down to Putin or something like that. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Rachel, for this really illuminating talk and conversation.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. It's a great time.